Welcome, everyone. The doctor is in. He has slid his curtains shut. Adam Harstad, Matt Waldman, film and theory. And we're going to talk today a little bit about Dr. Charles Goodhart, and how that relates to what we do in this space. And then talk about the concept of blowing up fantasy teams in Dynasty leagues and starting anew, and thoughts, tips, strategies, ideas, and go from there. So, Adam, always good to see you. Tell us about your latest Dynasty in theory, and what Charles Goodhart has to say, and who the hell he is.
Yeah, I'm actually not that familiar with Dr. Goodhart, the person. I just know his law, Goodhart's law, which is that when a metric becomes a target, it ceases to be a good metric. And listeners have probably encountered this in various forms. Basically, the idea is that, say you want to know something, like I want to be a better writer, let's say, and I want to measure my progress towards that goal. And there might be several measures that are decent measures of that. For instance, I could look at like page views. If more people are reading my work, that's probably a good measure that I'm becoming better and more successful as a writer. And that's well and good, like that probably is a fairly good measure. I tend to think that better writers tend to get more page views than worse writers, although obviously it's not a direct one-to-one correlation. But if I suddenly started optimizing for that, if that became a target, where if my goal shifted from I want to be a better writer to I want to get more page views, I would start doing a lot of things that would increase the number of page views I got without necessarily resulting in me being a better writer. I could say dumb and controversial things like Aaron Rodgers is not one of the top 50 quarterbacks in NFL history, and here's why. And that would result in a lot of page views, as Green Bay Packer fans flooded the article to tell me what an idiot I was, fairly, because that is a very dumb thing to say.
Ashton Jinsey doesn't have it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yes, there's lots of ways that I can generate page views that have nothing to do with how good my writing is. So when that measure that is probably an overall fairly good measure, when it becomes a target, it stops being a good measure. If I'm not optimizing for page views, then page views are probably a fairly good measure of how well I'm doing as a writer. But the second I start optimizing for them, they become a terrible measure of how well I'm doing as a writer. And as a result, I don't know if you track page views on your site. I never really know what my views are on anything that I write. A writer I like, Cory Doctorow, actually, he built a blog, and he had to custom build it because none of the kits out there would not track page views. And he very specifically wanted a site where he just can't even see how many views any given page gets. And so he relies on a different metric for how well he's doing, which is direct reader feedback. He figures if I'm doing well, I'll hear about it. And if I'm doing poorly, I'll hear about it. And so I always try to go that route too, where I try to use other measures of how well I'm doing, feedback of readers, feedback from peers and people I trust, various other measures. But that's always the risk. Whenever you have any sort of measure that's a good measure, as soon as you start optimizing for it, it becomes a very bad measure of the thing that you actually care about.
Makes sense. I see page views on mine, but I've always gone more with reader feedback, and I get a lot of reader feedback. So, and it's generally been positive. So that usually has guided my way more than page views, because the things that oftentimes I find that the things that I think are stupid as fuck, that it was just a throwaway thing that I didn't think was a big deal, gets the most popular looks. And I'm like, and then the things that I think were most valuable get the least, but they get the most reader feedback. And it usually takes a while for the reader feedback to come. Might be a month later, it might be 2 months later, it might be a year later. But then I start getting more of it for that same thing longer term. And I'm going, yeah, that was the better idea. The thing that was like the People magazine that got worn out more than somebody at a brothel, basically in a doctor's office. I just,
It's
you know,
disposable content,
yeah,
yeah. And there's other
disposable.
measures too. I know that like some people really like time on the page, and that's a good thing too. Like if you write something really thought provoking and engaging, people will read it for a while. But if I wanted to optimize, I could easily optimize for time on the page by adding a bunch of like pointless jargon words and adding unnecessary padding. And again, this is actively making me a worse writer in the pursuit of a metric that at one point was probably a pretty good metric. I've been told that on my articles, I have no idea what the page views are, but I've been told that I have pretty consistently time on page, which I take pride in because I think it means that I'm writing engaging content. But I don't want to ever optimize for that because I think that would make me worse as a writer.
Sure, sure. You're paying attention to the wrong goals. So, what are some things from a fantasy perspective that we could apply to that you feel like are kind of low hanging fruit of maybe as an industry or as analysts or even as readers and fantasy GMs that maybe we spend too much time on certain types of targets that are veering us away from the real goal there.
Yeah, so there's a lot of examples. I mean, one of my favorite things is to look at something and then wonder how it's ruined by Goodhart's law. And there's examples in sports, like in the NBA, like players will get paid based on their shooting percentage. It's a pretty big thing, and so you get to the end of a half and or the end of a quarter, and you have possession of the ball, and there's 2 seconds left, and you can try a half court heave for a 3 point. And if it goes in, you get 3 points. It's 3 free points, and if it doesn't go in, you've lost nothing. There's absolutely no cost to it whatsoever. But players are very reluctant to take that shot. They'll wait until they've mastered the art of waiting until just after the shot clock expired and then chucking the ball up like, oh, I tried to shoot it. I was just a little bit late. Oh, darn. As if professional athletes aren't very, very aware of like their location on the court and the time on the clock at all times. And so because the NBA has made this measure, shooting percentage, which is usually a pretty good measure of player quality, since they've made it a target, they've resulted in like fewer expected points. And so there's lots of examples in sports. In fantasy football, again, you can like sit and think when we do our player evaluations. A great example I like is targets. Or I'm not targets, sorry, drops. I know you're gonna nod your head at that. You go ahead and you can nod your head because you're an anti-drops truther. You're on that train with me. Where drops are a bad thing. This is a thing that we could measure, and if we add this to all of the other things that we track, the same receiver with more drops, that's worse, right? If you have the exact same receiver, if you cloned Jamar Chase and he was exactly the same in absolutely everything, but he had twice as many drops, that's a worse version of Jamar Chase. But I see a lot of fantasy football players who make that a target, where for years I had Mike Evans on my team and we'd be talking trade, and I mention Mike Evans, and they'd be, oh no, Mike Evans, he drops too many passes. Or Amari Cooper, that was the same thing. Amari Cooper,
Brandon
that was the book on
Marshall,
it.
yeah, yeah.
Brandon Marshall, Terrell Owens was always the worst offender. Terrell
Yes.
Owens was regularly among the league leaders in dropped passes, and that's bad. Like it's not good for Terrell Owens to be dropping so many passes. Had he caught those passes, he would have had more production. He would have been a more valuable receiver. So it is on its own a good measure. But once that measure becomes a target, once you're saying, no, I want receivers who don't drop passes, it's a terrible target. And you would have missed out on so many good, productive fantasy receivers over the years, even ignoring the fact that drops are so inconsistent from sample to sample, even if they were predictable. It's a measure that absolutely must not become a target if we want to optimize for like scoring points and winning games.
6'2" receivers who are 6'2" and over 200 pounds are the only ones you can draft.
Yeah. I mean, you were around for the massive height debates of 2014, 2015,
Yeah.
and people are running these correlations, and they're like, well, taller receivers are more productive. And yeah, if all else is equal, for the most part. I mean, there's archetypes, and somebody like Wes Welker, if Wes Welker was 6'6", he would have been a terrible receiver because that wasn't his game. With those long limbs, he can't do those quick and shifty cuts. But for the most part, being bigger than your opponent and being faster than your opponent, that's a good thing. As a measure, size and speed are good. But when they become a target, you wind up with someone like the Oakland Raiders under Al Davis, who's drafting Darius Hayward-Bay in the top 10 because he ran a ridiculously fast 40. And so again, the NFL, like, especially when it comes to evaluating players, I find, and I know you're going to agree with me, the whole landscape is just a minefield of measures that, like, we must not let become targets. They're good measures. They're things that we absolutely should measure and track and that add insight. But once they become a target, they just cease to do the job that we want of them.
For sure. I mean, the Eagles fucked up royally because they followed that whole height weight thing. And the way it's how you follow it and how you use it in context. I mean, it would have been good for them to use this, say, later on in their process. What they did was, we're not even gonna seriously consider any receivers under 6 foot whatever, 6'1", 6'2", and under 200 pounds. We're just, or 210 or whatever that ridiculous number was. And so they missed out on guys like Odell Beckham Jr. They missed out on some good players. And as a result of that, what should have happened was, if they were looking for someone tall for a specific position set, say they wanted a good X receiver who can go up and win the ball and be sturdy and make plays for you and still win downfield, or they wanted a flanker in a specific offense where they could handle the middle of the field and win tough targets, things like that, win off the jam if they needed to. Maybe what they do is continue to watch everybody, the whole player pool, and grade them the way you would grade them. And then you have your candidates at the end of who you most would love to pick at certain points in a draft. And then you look at that rule and you go, okay, between these two players, if all things are equal, do we prefer the taller guy with this because we believe that they've had more success? And even then, you still need to look at, one way they could have done that is more compensatory factors. If you have a receiver who's got that height and weight, but they're not explosive, they don't have a high vertical leap, they have problems technically catching a football, they've never played in an offense where they've had to show any nuance with being on the same page with their quarterback against difficult zones, or they don't move around the formation and have to see different things. And then you got a guy who's 5'9" and 195 pounds who has a 38-inch vertical leap, shows it on the field, is tough as nails, doesn't really get hurt, plays within himself and plays physically. And you go, well, his athletic ability compensates for his lack of height. And he's had experience in the role, and he does these things. That would be an intelligent way to maybe consider the information you want to consider, but also consider things differently. The same thing, Adam, that happened with people in the draft community was with Dalvin Cook. When Dalvin Cook came out, people were like, well, he runs a slow 40. He has a poor shuttle time, poor 3-cone drill, and his vertical leap is awful. And you could see it in high school even, that his spark scores were really bad, and it still doesn't look great in the combine. He's going to be a bust in the NFL because he's not explosive enough. And instead, what people learned is the thing, and I talked about this pre-draft with him, was compensatory factors, is that how does he run the football? What style does he use to play? And can that style translate to the NFL? And when you look at his style, it made perfect sense that what he does well didn't require the physical skills that were tested at the combine. He wasn't a hard cutting lateral stop start back. He was much more of a curvy linear mover who could maintain his speed with moving along a curve without having to perform those cuts. And he was a smart runner And when you look at how that translated, he was one of the best backs in the league for about a 2-3 year period, and a consistently good starter for longer than that. And that's again why, when you have a limit of these are the things we must impose, you can get into trouble as a result of that. I think we've seen that with Josh Allen, and how people have looked at Josh Allen. I certainly saw Josh Allen as someone that I didn't have a high grade on, but I saw as, when I looked at him, I felt like that people reversed Lamar Jackson and Josh Allen. Like the way they viewed Lamar Jackson, they should have been viewing him as more like Josh Allen, which was this project who had significant upside, but really didn't understand how to read a field, how to really work in a pocket, and had moments of hero ball that were just ridiculously bad, relying too much on your athletic ability. Whereas with Lamar Jackson, I felt like people should have seen him the way they were viewing Josh Allen, which was a guy who's really good in the pocket, someone who really handles it well, who can who has shown accuracy and experience in a pro-style offense, the pro-style offense of that time under Bobby Petrino, and happened to be a really good athlete on top of that, and just needed time and opportunity. But there were biases in the way that favored one over the other. I would jokingly say, sorry for folks who may disagree with me about this, but I would say this is the example of majority view DEI, or like some sort of half-at, what they think DEI is. Actually, it's benefiting them. And I think that was half of the problem, is that, they gave Lamar Jackson training wheels he didn't need. Josh Allen got training wheels and he needed it. Lamar needed development just like any other quarterback, but it literally took like the white male quarterback example of Peyton Manning to correct people on air 4 years later that Lamar Jackson was excellent in the pocket, for mass media to actually follow that truth that had been apparent since college. So I mean, again, you look at I digress, but you look at this and you realize that there are people who apply certain standards and they don't understand that you probably shouldn't. You look at Josh Allen and you would say on a surface level, what are we going to cut off? He'd be a guy that we'd say, nope, he's not going to make it in the NFL. We're not going to consider him. And he turned out to work out very well. And I think that's why, like for me, Adam, when I studied quarterbacks, there was a year or two that I had this thing in place where I decided that if there were certain traits with their game that existed, like that I felt like that they panicked in the pocket and they shied away from pressure when they were trying to throw the ball, and they wouldn't take a hit, or they would crumble up before things would come. Like things that I didn't want to make the same mistake I made with Blaine Gabbert years ago, liking Blaine Gabbert and then seeing him shy away from pressure. And so I decided I was going to impose something in there. And I wound up, the guys that I felt like shied away, that I had this whole, like, I don't care how high your grade is, if you don't meet this metric, you're automatically going down a tier for me. And the two guys were Carr and Garoppolo, and it turned out that it worked out for them, but I felt it was kind of coincidental, more than it was rooted in anything that I wanted to keep, because I kept seeing too many examples of, while I'm imposing this on quarterbacks, I'm arguing for Dalvin Cook. I'm arguing for players who don't fit certain rules that people want to impose. And I realized that even if this is working for these two players, this isn't the way I want to go about it. It's not a because they've also had long careers and
Yeah.
they've had
I mean,
some
I would argue
success.
overall, those were successful quarterbacks if
Yes,
compared to like the expectation, especially for second round picks,
yes,
because they were not top 5, top 10 picks. I think they dramatically outperformed their peers who were selected in a similar range. Yeah.
that's for sure. Now were they were they top tier starters and developed into that? No. And so if you're looking at it from that basis, since I don't really care about the round examination, though, I think it's a good way to analyze this particular thing because it does show they were successful NFL quarterbacks. They weren't Zach Wilson right now. They weren't Desmond Ritter right now, or Kenny Pickett, or as I've been joking, Jackson Dart's trying out for that boy band, pretty soon. Then, those are, those are examples of where those two guys have outperformed that potential failure point, dramatically.
And that I love that example because I think it really highlights the perniciousness of Goodhart's law, which is that something is true until the moment that you recognize that it's true and start accounting for it, and then it's no longer true. That's the big trap of it because like you mentioned Spark Score, and Spark Score was developed as this better measure of athleticism. And the thing is, at the time Spark Score was developed, it was a better measure of athleticism. Like it was an improvement, and had teams had a time machine and been able to go back and incorporate Spark Score into their previous analysis would have been better. But once it was invented and once teams recognized it and said, hey, this is a better tool, and started incorporating it, or their own proprietary insider Spark Score like stats, once they started incorporating that, it no longer provided an edge. All of a sudden, that metric had become a target, and it was no longer a good metric. Or I think often of Bill Parcells' planet theory, which was that at any given moment in time, there are only so many men on the planet who are big enough and athletic enough to play offensive line. And so he just drafted guys who were big and athletic because, there's a limited pool on the planet. I want as many people from that pool as possible and things will work out. And at the time, that was probably true. But as soon as he speaks planet theory into existence, it no longer is true.
Or
The
his
metric has become a
quarterback,
target.
or his quarterback metrics, which was what I was going to bring up just before you said Parcells, and I was thinking that too because it's like once he started talking about 62% completion percentage,
Yep.
quarterback wins, height, weight, size, major school, at least 2 years as a starter,
Yeah. I mentioned Rodgers earlier. And one of the things that's always been fascinating to me about Aaron Rodgers is that, again, I think he's a top 10 all time quarterback. I don't really think that's debatable at this point. But if you look at his profile, I feel like the things he does worst at are the things the public cares the least about.
Yeah.
Things like, like his yards per attempt would be low, but his touchdown percentage would be really high. Or, and the things he did the best at were the things the public cared the most about. Things he did worst at were the things the public cared the least about. And so if you look at his statistical profile for his career, it's a very weird statistical profile. Like there's not been a quarterback in history who had such a high touchdown percentage and such a low interception percentage, but also at the same time such a low yard per attempt total. Usually those things all kind of go hand in hand, and it creates a profile. And his sack percentage was fairly high, and his completion percentage was also fairly high, and it creates. I'm not suggesting that Aaron Rodgers was like padding his stats, because again, he was a top 10 quarterback of all time. His production was really unimpeachable, but it creates the perception of a quarterback who cared about the stats that people cared about more than the stats that people didn't care about. And I would suggest that had Aaron Rodgers been a little bit worse at the things people cared about and a little bit better at the things they didn't care about, he would have been even more productive, even more valuable over the course of his career. The Peyton Manning's always the counterexample I give, where people rag on Peyton Manning for his interception percentage, and it was traditionally a little bit higher than you would expect to see from one of these top 10 all-time quarterbacks. But if you also look, like his long shot fourth quarter comeback percentage was the best in history. Like no quarterback was more likely to win a game where he was down multiple scores late in the fourth quarter, and that kind of went hand in hand with the interception percentage. Or Peyton Manning was one of the top 2 sack avoidant quarterbacks in history, along with Dan Marino. And that's another thing that the public doesn't really care about. It almost seems like the less the public cared about a stat, but the more it correlated with actual winning on the field, the better Peyton Manning was at it. Whereas like the more emphasis the public placed on it, like interception percentage, kind of the worse Peyton Manning did. So that to me, like quarterback, how we evaluate quarterbacks to me is rife with Goodhart's law, that we care about things that are on their face good measures. But then once they become a target, it's no longer optimal in terms of like if we're trying to optimize for chances of winning the game. Like once a quarterback starts trying to optimize their interception percentage at all costs, well, that's going to make you less likely to win in the fourth quarter of a game where you're down big, because you have to risk these interceptions. You have to make these risky throws if you're going to make the big comeback. And I think it's very notable that if you look at Aaron Rodgers' fourth quarter comeback record over his career, it's significantly worse than you would expect from somebody who was like a top 10 quarterback of all time. Like if you're comparing him to his peers like Drew Brees and Tom Brady and Peyton Manning, he greatly suffers from the comparison in that specific.
Or his predecessor.
Yeah, Brett Favre, who threw a ton of interceptions. Yeah, Brett Favre, I think, is a great example of a guy who didn't really care about what the public cared about. Like he never let a metric become a target.
No, not remotely. And I think this applies in so many areas of life, obviously, because you see businesses fail all the time in their goals because they do try to make something a target rather than what's really contextually going to be more helpful. And you can talk about, but you talk about Favre. Steve McNair, I remember way back in the day when he was developing as a player, the coaches felt like he was being too careful about not throwing interceptions because he was worried about that. And that eventually, once he stopped caring about that so much, he became a better quarterback because he was willing to take risk. And part of what we have to understand with the game, and this happens all the time when we watch, we see this with fighting, any type of professional fighting, because there's the stats that are used with fighting, really we know, other than to win on a scorecard where percentage of punches struck, maybe something that's interesting and a valuable metric on for entertainment purposes, but at the same time, you're gonna, or how many punches you made someone miss, were you able to make them miss, and how good your defense is. I mean, that's part of the sport, but at the same time, you're going to get hit. And sometimes if you get hit hard or you get rocked and lose, and someone takes advantage of you with that, if you're a good fighter, you're going to understand maybe in the next round, I'm going to set it up so he thinks he's setting me up for that again. And then I'm going to counter with this, and I'm going to knock his ass out because of that, And I think that we forget with football that those same things happen. They come to this. Matthew Stafford, with his experience, can come to the sideline and say, you know what, the defense is showing me this, and then they keep doing that. So why don't we call this concept, but instead of like everyone's going to run it the same except for Tutu Atwell. We're going to have Tutu Atwell do fake this and then work across here. The spacing's going to be just fine, and it's going to completely fool the safety who's been sitting on this particular area when we run this concept because he studied it all week and he thinks that he knows what we're doing every time we do it. And they score, or they have a huge game-flipping play. These things happen a lot in all sorts of games and sports, and but if you were going to follow it in I would call it jokingly a corporate-like fashion, where it's like, now you've made this a target and you've fucked up everything within your division the way you're managing it because you didn't account for that there's more nuance to the craft of what's happening below you, and you're not manufacturing widgets, that that you're missing out on the potential benefits of mistakes or not hitting the mark that is just supposed to be a byproduct of the actual goal.
Right. Yeah, you mentioned McNair, and I think I've said this before. One of my favorite trivia questions is there's only 2 quarterbacks in history who have 2 of the top 10 sack avoiding seasons of all time. One of them is Dan Marino. That's no surprise. Dan Marino was very hard to sack. The other one is Joey Harrington. And his first 2 years, he had his marching orders, and his orders were don't make negative plays, right? Don't take sacks, don't get hit. And so he did that. That was his target. And in theory, avoiding sacks is a good thing. But when avoiding sacks comes at the cost of like making throws, it's a very bad thing. And he wrote towards the end of his career, or after his career, he went into Steve Mariucci's office one day and said, look, I need permission to make mistakes. I need you to tell me that it's okay for me to make a mistake. And Mariucci wouldn't give it to him. And so he kept on, like, okay, anytime there's any pressure, I'm chucking the ball out of bounds. His yards per attempt was just atrocious, but he wasn't taking sacks. And that's, I think, one of the best examples of a metric that absolutely became a target and just completely ruined that Detroit Lions offense and almost derailed Harrington's entire career. And he went elsewhere. He later had a resurgence with Miami, where he was suddenly he was taking sacks again, but he was a much better player for it. And I always think there's this idea that because we can measure something, we should. Because we can track something, we should. And it's good. And in theory, data is value neutral. More data is good. Before we didn't really pay attention to sack percentage. If we pay attention to sack percentage as well, we're going to have a better understanding of the game. Or my big hobby horse is first downs. Nobody cares about first downs when they're like the core of the game is yards and first downs. They're one of 2 things that matter in the NFL is getting yards and getting first downs. And nobody cares. Who has the all-time record for receiving first downs? Nobody knows. They could tell you who has the record for touchdowns. They could tell you who has the record for yards. Single season, obviously. Career record's obviously going to be Jerry Rice for everything. But nobody even cares. And I think that, yes, we should track first downs. We should pay attention to first downs. I think it would give us a better understanding of our game. I think that this is a measure that, if it became a little bit more of a target, would probably be fairly good. But I also think that data is not always as value neutral as we think it is, because once we start tracking something, there's always going to be that temptation to make it a target, right? We start tracking first downs, and now there's this temptation to overrate receivers who are really good at that one aspect of getting first downs. Just like we started tracking targets, which in theory is good, but then all of a sudden we start drops. We started tracking drops, which in theory is good. And all of a sudden we started underrating the receivers who are more prone to drops. And so I try to be very cautious, even about what numbers I pay attention to, because there's a risk. I say, we value what we measure. So make sure you measure what you value. And don't be measuring these extraneous things, because whether you can tell yourself with the best of intentions, okay, well, I know it doesn't really matter. I'm just not going to pay attention to it, but you will. If it's there, you're going to pay attention to it. If you're doing your game charting and you start tracking something that doesn't correlate to performance, it's invariably going to influence your scouting reports on a player where like, oh, he's not good at this thing that doesn't matter, and that lowers my opinion of him. Yeah. I think it's Goodhart's is very pernicious that we have to be very careful with what we pay attention to, because if we pay attention to the wrong things, whether we mean to or not, unconsciously, it's really going to ruin our chances of achieving our goals.
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, they're a good example of something in the outside world again that fits that is sleep. There's a lot of sleep data out there, and even sleep researchers are like, the more you pay attention to this, the more pressure you're going to put on yourself to actually go to sleep, and the more anxiety you're going to actually have about going to sleep. And it actually takes you further away from what your goal is, which is to actually just get a good night's sleep.
Or walking speed is one of my favorites. That researchers have found that your average walking speed is a very strong predictor of all cause mortality over the coming year. That people who like their natural comfortable walking speed is faster are much more likely to survive long term than people whose natural comfortable walking speed is slower. And there's a bunch of reasons for this. Like a lot of it is that like if you have a significant injury or illness, this will dramatically slow down your walking speed. Like a lot of it's lurking variables where it's capturing things. Grip strength is another one where like if you have a really good grip strength, your survival rate's really good. But that's because like if you've had a stroke or like some major injury, like your grip strength's not going to be as good. And then also there are a lot of other complicating factors with that. So this is a measure that in theory, like yes, walking speed, true, 100% true, does correlate with all cause mortality. But if that became a target, if the advice then became, if you just walk faster, you're not going to die this year. You're more likely to survive into your old age if you just walk faster. All of a sudden, that correlation would disappear.
That's
Everybody
more
would
likely
just
me walking my dog who likes to drag me along in wooded paths. I'm more likely to die probably hitting my head on a rock. I'm trying
right.
to walk faster through hilly wooded bike path trails in the woods with
Right.
that's
Yeah.
that, yeah,
If people
exactly.
are focusing on it, if it becomes a target, then any of the incidental correlations, any of the little lurking variables it's picking up on, it's not going to pick up on them anymore. And that correlation is probably going to vanish.
Yeah. So let's talk about blowing up dynasty teams. Like if
Let's.
yeah, because I can tell you a lot of my teams I've let get old, and I've decided to see if I could do that, and I'm realizing, I had to blow up a dynasty team last year, and I may have one or two that I may be blowing up in the coming seasons. We'll see. But what's your thoughts on, you know, blowing up a dynasty squad? What are your experiences with it, if any, and any advice that you would give?
Yeah, so I have done in my dynasty career just one true strip to studs rebuild. And when I say strip to studs, extremely strip to studs. I forget the exact numbers. It was like a 24 player roster, and I think year over year I turned over like 19 or 20 of those roster spots. And the guys I kept, it wasn't like I had like a core guy like, oh, I'm just going to keep Patrick Mahomes and build around him. It was like guys kind of on the fringe of my roster where they were too good to cut, but also I thought undervalued by the community, so I couldn't get anything for him. Like I had Leonard Fournette when he first went to Tampa, when Jacksonville cut him. And everybody's like, oh, Leonard Fournette, he got cut by Jacksonville. He's completely done. And I'm like, well, he's kind of a little old to hold through a rebuild, but nobody's going to give me anything at all for him. And he's still a former first round pick. And he's still, he's still a guy who was like top 12 in each of his first 3 seasons. And the underlying fundamentals are still there. So I wound up holding him. And it was a very good decision. He wound up having another top 12 finish with the Buccaneers. And then, he built the legend of playoff Lenny and everything. So I did one true strip to the studs rebuild. And I thought like, hey, as a fun exercise, I'm just going to like blog about it the whole way through, like in real time, because it's very easy after the fact. Like you do a successful rebuild and you're like, hey, here's what I did. Like, aren't I so smart? And I'm like, I don't know if this is going to blow up in my face or not, but I'm just going to blog about it in real time. And then this will be a useful tool for me after the fact. I can look back and I can evaluate my process. I can scout my processes and be like, this was a good idea. This was a bad idea. This was a good idea that didn't work out, and so on. And it wound up being like unbelievably successful. I won the title the very next year, and was a strong competitor until the league wound up folding like 3 years later. I was setting league records for points scored. After I made the final trade of the rebuild, I like all-time league records for points scored. So I have only done one, and it was very successful. And I'll shoot you a link if you want. You can put it in the show notes or something. I have the sequence of blog posts that go through the decision to rebuild, the steps I took, and the long-term results.
Great.
There's two reasons why I've only had, well, I guess three reasons why I've only had one in my Dynasty career, because I've been playing Dynasty since 2007, so almost 20 years now. And there's two reasons why I've only had one. One is that they're a lot of work and I'm kind of lazy. Two is that I'm quite good at Dynasty, so I don't frequently find myself in a position where I'm like, hey, this thing needs to be torn down. And even the one I tore down, it wasn't like it was the worst team in the league. I feel like the best time to rebuild is before you hit that point.
Yeah,
because once you've hit that point,
you just feel like it's getting stagnant and it's
right,
plateaued. And
right. It's one of those where
yeah,
like I'm not good enough to win, but I'm old enough that I'm going to be hemorrhaging value.
yes,
And that's really the ideal time. I have good players, but not enough of them. And so I don't want to waste all of my players' value on these seasons where I have such low odds of winning. I would rather cash it in now for whatever I can get and focus on future years. And for me, future years meant 1 to 2 years max. I think people enter into these perpetual rebuilds, and that's a huge trap. It does not take that long to rebuild a dynasty roster. There's a reason people call the NFL the not for long. The turnover is fast. So yeah, the second reason is I'm fairly good at Dynasty, and the third reason, I forget the third reason now. Yeah, I'm lazy and I'm good at Dynasty, so I don't rebuild very often. Oh, the third reason is that I tend to be very respecting of randomness. I think my threshold for this team doesn't have a shot is much, much higher than most people's threshold, where if you look at it, the best team in the league has about a 25 to 33% chance of winning it all in any given year. People overrate how heavy of a favorite the favorites are. But on the other end of the spectrum, that number 6 seed who just snuck into the playoffs might still have like a 5 to 10% chance of winning. And so cashing in a number 4, 5, 6 seed kind of season for a rebuild, it's a very high cost. I need to be confident that I can make up those extra 5 to 10% odds that I'm giving up now on the back end. And usually I'm not that confident. I think for most people, it's better off playing these kind of middling squads and seeing what happens and letting the chips fall where they may. I think that's going to maximize the number of championships in the long run. I'm not saying never to rebuild. I have another article, I'll send you the link, you can put in the show notes, but it goes into the process of deciding what's the right time to rebuild. I don't think it should be never, but I think people are, first of all, too quick to rebuild, too quick to give up on seasons that they shouldn't give up on. I've seen, because I've been playing for a long time and because you've been playing for a long time, I'm sure you're going to have many similar stories, but I've seen teams that were like 4-7 after week 11, who won the last 2 games of the season, snuck into the playoffs at 6-7 and won it all. I saw a team once that was second to last in the entire league in points scored heading into the playoffs and set the all-time league scoring record in the playoffs, was the highest scorer every single week, walked away with like the most improbable championship that I've ever seen. So I think people are too quick to rebuild. And then I think too quick to decide to rebuild, but too slow to actually rebuild. Once they decide they're going to rebuild, they enter kind of this perpetual where a great example of a metric becoming a target. They're valuing youth for the sake of youth. And in theory, when you're rebuilding, youth is good. But if all you're looking at is youth, you're going to be young forever and you're going to be bad forever. At some point, you need to have a plan for exiting the rebuild and competing again. Unless like having a young team is your happy place, fantasy football is an entertainment activity. If it makes you happy to have nothing but rookies every year, then more power to you. But if your goal is winning, long-term winning, you need to have an exit strategy. So hang on, I'm gonna look those up now before I forget. And
sure.
I'll
send them to me on our where we usually correspond. And we're good. But yeah, I mean, it's funny. I've had one rebuild as well. I did that last year. I blew up my team last year in a league where the year before I won a championship, and my best starting receiver was Demario Douglas. So it was like a very fun moment, but I had a powerhouse of a defense, but it was getting older. I could see that like my best running backs were Nick Chubb and Ramondre Stevenson, and Bryce Young wasn't exactly working out, and it was a year before, and I had just added Michael Penix, I think, and I knew that Russell Wilson and Bryce Young weren't doing it for me, so I was going to have to start getting rid of players and getting picks, and so I got a shit ton of picks last year. And now, looking at this team, it's probably another year away from me really being able to contend. But it's players that I feel, pretty good about and have a chance to, continue down that road and improve. I've done the same. And I would say even like there's another league. I would say this one's more. There's a league I'm in that is a Devi Dynasty league that's IDP, but the way it's done is that you in the rookie draft you can only pick, or the rookie draft you have a rookie draft, but they're leftovers from the Devi drafts because the Devi draft is you get 4 picks every year, and you can only pick one from each class. So that's in terms of what their graduating class is, you can only pick one. So as a result of that, you're always kind of rebuilding in some respects with that on some level. But sometimes, some things that I've found that I've done that as a team that you're either on the verge of rebuilding or it's a rebuilding strategy, I guess, in one way is focusing on stockpiling one position really well. And because odds are you're going to wind up with a surplus, and then you can start dealing for players that you want rather than getting a bunch of unproven players at various positions. I'd rather, if I pick 7 wide receivers and then 1 year, I mean, this may be a longer term deal, but like one way I would look at it is I could see how you could take like in a league where you might pick 5 wide receivers out of 7 picks. And then the next year you pick 5 more wide receivers out of 7 picks. And people are like, what are you trying to do? Field a whole team with wide receivers? Because I did that with running backs in this Devi league. And I had literally like half my roster was running backs, and they were all making fun of me about it. But this year, I did this over 2 years, but this year now, my team has Ja'Cory Krosky, Merritt, Quinshawn Judkins, and Cam Scatabo as guys that I can start. And then the rest, are guys that I can either trade away and get other options for as part of a stockpile who are, as we go. And I think that's a simple way that you can go about doing it if you're getting started, is that rather than spreading your eggs in all about, put them in one basket in a way where you can then expand on it. Because I feel like it's harder to go 0 for 7 on wide receivers than it is to go 0 for 7 on picking one running, 2 running backs, 3 wide receivers, 1 tight end, and a quarterback. I think that's easier for you to go 0 for 7. But if you keep going to the well on wide receivers, I think you're bound to end up with 2 or 3, and then you might be able to trade one of those for a running back that's more of a surer thing.
If you're curious about the math on it, in theory, that is actually true. My favorite thought experiment is reductio ad absurdum. Like if you took something to its absolute logical extreme, what would the result be? And if you picked literally every running back entering the NFL, you would be guaranteed to have 10 top 10 running backs. If you owned every running back in the league, you're guaranteed at least 10 hits if we're defining a hit as a top 10 running back. Whereas if you pick half the running backs and half the wide receivers, you're not guaranteed 10 hits. So mathematically, yes, it is harder to come up snake eyes the larger a share of the position you wind up controlling. I will say the effect is probably extremely small in terms of like if you're holding 10 running backs. That represents just a tiny fraction of the potential. Like maybe that's a sixth of the running backs with the potential to hit the top 10. You've got double the share of your league mates, but the effect is small. And it also caps your upside too. Whereas, if
Yeah.
you have all of the running backs, you're only going to get 10 top 10 players at their position. Whereas if you had half the running backs and half the receivers, it's possible you could have 20 players who are top 10 at the position if you lucked into all 10 of the top running backs and all 10 of the top receivers. So in theory, mathematically, spreading your picks around increases your upside and your downside. Focusing on a single position will reduce your variance. But I just want to say the effect is going to be super, super tiny and marginal. And also, too, you could wind up like you're going to be very exposed to just variance in incoming classes. Like if you were stockpiling running backs in 2017, you're probably doing very well for yourself today. If you were stockpiling running backs in 2015,
yeah.
right, like in one of these worst running back classes, you're probably, it doesn't matter how many picks you made, if there's no good players there, you're not going to get any good players. So I will say, in terms of the size of the effect, I think that might be more of a comfort thing. Like it might make you feel better, but I don't want to diminish the importance of doing things that are psychologically comfortable. And yes, technically, mathematically speaking, it is true that it does decrease the risk of rolling snake eyes across everything.
Yeah. I mean, again, you're looking and you're also, it depends on where your other strengths are. Like if you are strong at other positions and you feel like, or you have some budding players and you've already picked reasonably well, like in this league, I already had Marvin Harrison. I already had Ricky Pearsall. I had, a couple other players who were starters. I could only start two. And I thought I had no running backs. I'm going to pick. So, and you're funny. I have 10 running backs in this league, and I had 17 actually at one point out of a 35-man roster because I figured I could pick at other positions right now off the waiver wire and work out. So, but you're right. What have I wound up with? I mean, Chris Brooks, Taj Brooks, Ja'Cory Krosky Merritt, Trevor Etienne, Quinshon Judkins, Kyle Monongeis, Cam Scatabo, Brashard Smith, Tyjae Spears, and Sean Tucker. And then sitting on my Devi roster are guys like Isaac Brown, who was a wonder kid at Louisville, Justice Haynes, who was probably going to be one of the higher round picks at Michigan, and so I have 12 running backs technically on my roster right now. With that, now I've also picked up at other positions, but as I've started to go, so I have guys like Carson Beck and Bryce Underwood, who are both, guys that are going to factor into the draft. And I've picked some wide receivers as well out of that. But I hear you. I think that's a good point to make.
I'll also say too, like unbalanced rosters are great in leagues that are fairly liquid. If you have league mates that you can get some trades done.
That's right.
I love unbalanced rosters, and I frequently have unbalanced rosters, but that's because I'm very confident in my ability to make trades when I need to. If you're in a league where trading is much rarer, it becomes more important to have roster balance through your picks and through your pickups because you're less likely to be able to rebalance your portfolio through the trade market.
True.
But in my experience, most dynasty leagues, I played in a league where everybody's like, "Oh, this is such an inactive league; it's impossible to trade." And that was the league I did my complete strip to studs rebuild. I wound up like half of the trades in that league that year I was involved in, and I'm like, "It's not hard to trade. You guys just are not good at trading." I feel like a lot of the times, if it's hard to trade, the solution is it's a personal solution. Like there are things that you can do to make trades more possible. I have yet to find a league where it was really impossible to trade. But I've got specific skills and some of them don't really generalize. And for me rebuilding, it's all a question of like my 3-word mantra when I'm rebuilding is don't lose value. Because the need to rebuild to me is always a question of value. if the total value on my roster is high enough, I'm contending. Even if it's all like, even if none of my players are productive, if I have enough roster value, I can trade that roster value for production at any given time, and I can compete and I can contend. In a 12-team league, on average, each team will have 1/12 of the total value in the league at any given time. But in practice, like the best team is going to have 1/6 of the total value, and the worst team is going to have 1/20th or 1/25th or something. And so to me, the need to rebuild is always driven by a lack of value. And the thing about player value is that it just across the board, on average, like obviously some players will go up, some players will go down, but as a whole, it's going to decrease something like 20% year over year. Because if you think about it, like at any given time, this year's rookie class represents maybe 20% of the total value in the pool. Well, next year, there's going to be a new rookie class, and that rookie class is going to represent 20% of the available value. So the current player pools, the guys who are currently in the league, they're going to see their share decrease from 100% down to 80%. And so I always say, in any given year, the typical roster is going to lose about 20% of its value and then add it back in rookie picks. So if you can just build a roster that's not losing 20% of its value, just by standing still, you're actually pulling ahead. Everybody else is losing value. You're staying in the same place. And that to me is how you rebuild. So when I rebuild, I always focus on asset classes that historically have held their value better. Rookie picks are the big one. Rookie picks never get injured. Rookie picks never tear an ACL. They never get suspended for doing something dumb. If one particular player underperforms, usually there's another player who will shoot up the boards to offset. So rookie picks tend to be very safe stores of value. They don't really lose value over time compared to someone like Joe Burrow has definitely lost value. He got injured. His value has gone down. And typically Joe Burrow would represent a player who is very, very safe because he's a proven veteran quality NFL quarterback. And that's another area I tend to focus on in rebuilds. People focus on youth, but I tend to want a proven quarterback in his prime. I would rather have Patrick Mahomes on a rebuilding team than somebody who's young just for the sake of being young.
Same with tight
because
ends. Same with the
tight
ends.
Same with tight ends, where like people think that a 22-year-old is going to have an 8-year NFL career, but what's the average? You probably know better than I. What's the average career length in the NFL? Something like 3 or 4 years.
Right, 2.5.
Yeah, and that's because of young players washing out when they're 23, 24. Most 22-year-old tight ends are not going to play until they're 30. Some of them will, but a 28-year-old tight end who is very, very good is more likely to still be playing in 4 years than a 22-year-old tight end who was like a second-round pick, and we kind of don't know what we have.
And more likely maybe to play 7 years.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I always like to model aging in terms of survival curves, where it's like mortality tables, actuarial tables, like the Social Security Administration uses, to see like how likely is somebody who is 65 today, how long are they likely to live, players in their prime. But even that, I don't want people to think there's no such thing as a safe store of value in Dynasty other than rookie picks. Even like stars, all pros, like Dez Bryant. Dez Bryant was an all-pro receiver at 26, and he was basically done as a fantasy contributor at 28. There's millions of examples. Maurice Jones-Drew, David Boston, like as a 22, 23-year-old receiver, had like 1,500 yards as a sophomore. Was done at like Josh Gordon. There's so many examples. There are no safe stores of value other than rookie picks, but there are safer stores of value. So I like proven veteran quarterbacks, even if they're a little bit old, like Dak Prescott. I would rather have Dak Prescott in a rebuild than maybe like Cam Ward, who is very, very young. And in theory, if he hits, you might have 15 years, but a rebuild shouldn't be taking more than 2 or 3 years. And I have a higher confidence that Dak Prescott will be a productive quarterback 2 years from now than I do that Cam Ward will be a productive quarterback 2 years from now. Prescott's like what, 31? Based on aging history, it's not at all surprising if Prescott plays until he's 35. Now, if Cam Ward, like comparing to another quarterback who's actually shown, Jaden Daniels, like obviously I'd much prefer Jaden Daniels to Dak Prescott because he's past that first threshold. We're much more confident that he can cut it in the NFL than we are about Cam Ward. He's past that first filter. But it's important not to value youth just for the sake of youth. So yeah, I like proven quarterbacks in their prime, second contract guys making hundreds of millions of dollars, not necessarily like the Daniel Joneses of the world. Although even look at Daniel Jones, right? Like people were like, oh, Daniel Jones, he got that huge contract from the Giants, he's terrible. But even guys like Daniel Jones often have multiple years and second acts and extra chances. So yeah, I like proven quarterbacks. I like rookie receivers, not because I like rookie receivers per se, but because there's always a window after a rookie receiver's rookie season where even if he was bad, people will talk themselves into all the excuses for why he was bad. Like someone like N'Keal Harry had pretty much the most catastrophic rookie season you could imagine. And if you look at his Dynasty ADP, it fell by like 6 or 8 slots. And so that in terms of a store of value, provided you're going to be willing to sell that receiver after the season if he doesn't show anything. And a lot of people really struggle to pull the trigger on that because then they start getting in their head like, well, what if N'Keal Harry goes on to be the next, Demaryius Thomas was another guy who had an underwhelming rookie receiver and then went on to be an all-pro. But I like rookie receivers provided you're going to have the follow through and you're going to sell if they don't perform as rookies. So I like buying rookie receivers and selling sophomore receivers, even if they're nominally young and in theory a good fit for a rebuild. I always sell any aging all pros, Devontae Adams, Travis Kelce. I don't care how good they are, how productive they are. There's a guaranteed value loss. Even if their play doesn't fall off, it's a guaranteed value loser over the next year or two while you're rebuilding around them. And the one thing a rebuilding team can't afford to do is lose value. But the big thing is, I mentioned Leonard Fournette, who was not at all a fit for my rebuild, but he was undervalued. And that's the big thing is if you stockpile undervalued players, and if you're right, not only are you not losing value, you're actually gaining value. So those are the big things. I love rookie picks. They're a lot harder to get now than they were 5 to 10 years ago. The market has become much tighter on rookie picks. And so I pivoted more to buying rookie receivers, selling sophomore receivers who underperformed as rookies, buying proven veteran quarterbacks, and hunting for undervalued assets who might not necessarily fit a traditional rebuild. A guy like Javonte Williams was a similar guy like that, where there's like a profile of running back where they were highly drafted. They showed enough, but overall they were a disappointment in their first stint. I like to buy those guys and see if there's a second act. J.K. Dobbins would be another guy where he showed a lot in his first stint, but was ultimately a disappointment. People didn't get what they expected. I like adding guys like Javonte Williams and J.K. Dobbins and Leonard Fournette, who are heavily discounted. They're classic dented cans. And kind of seeing what happens on the second stint and hoping if we can actually not just not lose value, but actually gain value.
Great stuff. Well, listen, folks, we're gonna head out, but you can check out more of Adam's work at Football Guys, Dynasty in Theory, Odds and Ends, some stuff on betting if you're interested in that. Regressions, kickers, you got it. And of course, check out the RSP cast, subscribe, and Adam and I'll be on next week and talk about more Dynasty and film and theory and all the different things that we do. Thanks again.